Good morning. It is an enormous honor to be here with you today. Congratulations to all of the graduates, to the faculty and staff of the university, and also to all of your families. It definitely takes a village to get somebody through college, so all of you deserve enormous each other's gratitude. I want to talk to you about the story that has been told about race and racism in this country, the story that has developed particularly over the last 50 years or so. So the story goes something like this. It says, in our country, way back long ago, bad things used to happen. There was a genocide, there was slavery, there was the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, there was violence committed against people of color. And then some heroic people, heroic individuals took spontaneous action, and all Americans began to see the light of why racism was so terrible. Then we changed the laws and we became colorblind. Then we elected President Obama and we became post-racial. And now, today, the only people who talk about race are people of color, and their goal is to divide us and to avoid responsibility when they do so. That is the story, the dominant story that we hear about race and racism in the country today. It's all over Fox News. It's actually all over CNN. You don't have to be a conservative to think in this way about our racial dynamics. In this story, racism is defined as always being individual and intentional and overt. So the racist always knows that he or she is being racist and takes that action with full knowledge and in very obvious and overt ways. In this definition, the rules of our society don't really get implicated. So it's not about the structural arrangements that we make that keep certain people in certain jobs and other people in certain neighborhoods and prevent our hospitals from serving everybody or our schools from educating everybody. In this definition of racism, everything happens in the individual mind, and any effort to bring our society together to undo the terrible harms that have been done, all those efforts are about, they have to live in the individual. As a society, as a community, there's nothing collective that really we can do. And when we define racism that way and we tell this story about racism, we've decided really that this is as good as it's going to get. We outlawed the worst forms of racism, the most direct forms. When people engage in those very direct forms, then we punish them. And we leave the rest of it alone. We don't look too carefully at all of the other decisions we make, how our immigration policy works, how our jobs get developed, how our cities are zoned, how our schools are funded. All of those things in a colorblind society are race neutral, and they do not contribute to anything, and we don't really need to worry about them as a collective. This is as good as it's going to get. Some people will still behave in racist ways, and when they do, we will punish them, and that's that. That's the best we can do. But I think we all know that as good as it's going to get is not good enough. I think we all know that people of color are paying with their lives and with their families for that mythology of colorblindness and post-racialism. Trayvon Martin paid with his life. Marcelo Lucero, who is less well known but important to me, he paid with his life. Lucero was an Ecuadorian immigrant who was beaten to death on the streets of Brooklyn one night as he was walking home from spending time with his friends, beaten by 3 men who shouted that he was an illegal and needed to go back to where he had come from. And they didn't mean Ecuador when they said go back to where he had come from. They meant to send his soul back to where it had come from while they beat him to death. There are thousands of American Indian women in the country who pay with their lives, because do you know that Indian tribes are not allowed to prosecute people who are not Indian when they commit crimes against Indian people. So if you are a Native woman and your partner abuses you, is violent towards you, or you are raped, and that rapist, that partner, the murderer, is not also Indian, then the only people who can prosecute that person are the federal courts. And yet many reservations are located hundreds of miles away from any federal court. And so there are non-Native men abusing Native women with impunity, knowing that nothing will ever happen to them because of the way we have arranged the rules of our society. So this is as good as it can get. That's really not good enough. It's not good enough when people are paying with their lives. So it's time to change that story that we tell about race in our society, and we need everybody to participate in making that change. There are 3 things that you can do to contribute to that change. The first thing you can do is to be explicit about your concerns around racism and to be frank about that discussion. The second thing you can do is engage everyone, including white people, in that discourse. And the third thing you can do is embrace emotional danger, because fighting racism, fighting any kind of oppression, is not emotionally pleasant all of the time, although it does bring much joy with it. So on the first thing, being explicit. We can't take apart a problem that we can't talk about. So if you can't say the word race, if you can't say the word racism, if you can't say black people or African Americans, if you can't say white, then it's going to be very, very difficult to take on this scourge that has shaped the relationships that we have in our country. We want to be unified, and we think that not talking about the hard things is what's going to keep us together. But in fact, we have to talk about those hard things because that's the way that we can actually create the kind of equity that is required for a community to be unified. Diversity by itself is not enough. And I really applaud people who and institutions who take on diversity, who want to be diverse, who take pains to put themselves in those diverse situations. But diversity by itself can really just mean that you're bringing people to the party, that you're getting the bodies in the room. It doesn't necessarily speak to what people are doing once they get in the room. I really do think of it like a party. So if David invites me to a party and I respect and like David enough and I'm curious to see what kind of party he might throw, then I'm going to go to the party. But if I arrive at the party and the music doesn't suit me, maybe it gives me a headache, maybe I don't find it very danceable, maybe it bores me, and I cannot change the music, the DJ doesn't take requests, and the iPod is kind of stuck on a do not change mode. If I can't change the music at the party and the music doesn't suit me, I'm not going to stay at the party very long. So in order to have a really unified party, you've got to make it possible for people to change the music, to shift that agenda, to set it. I want to tell you the story of a group that I work with in Idaho, the Idaho Community Action Network. This is a statewide organization in one of the whitest states in the country, a state with a long history, a history that is definitely beginning to change, but a long history of white supremacist activity, compounds, people being trained with guns and bombs, etc. In the state of Idaho, the Idaho Community Action Network has built an organization that includes working people, struggling people who are white, who are Native American, and who are Latino. And one of the problems they encountered was that when families would go in to apply for the state children's health insurance program, they would all get denied. And they decided we need to go test this system and see why it is that people get denied and what we can do about that. So initially, they were just going to go in pairs. And then someone suggested that they do a matched trio testing project, that they send in trios, a white family, a Native family, and a Latino family with similar characteristics to apply for the program and see what happened. And initially, people said, well, why do we want to do that? We're all together. We want a universal solution. We don't want to divide ourselves by talking about how we're different or treated differently by the system. And yet, people were in fact treated differently by the system. So the racial justice activists in the group prevailed, and they did this testing project, and they found some really interesting things. They sent in 27 people, 26 were denied. So nearly all of them, 99%. And they found that for everybody, the form was a problem, the application form. It was very long, it was complicated, you could miss one little thing, and then you'd be denied, and nobody would tell you why you were denied and help you figure out how to actually fill out the form. They found that the hours that the office was open, that was a problem. 8 to 4, that's when people work, so you can't be sitting around at the S-chip office all day long. But in addition to those problems, they also found that when the Latinas went in, they were asked all these intrusive questions. Who is the father of these children? How did you get across the border? How many of the kids in this family are undocumented, in this case, illegals, quote unquote illegals? And all these questions that the federal government has said you are not supposed to ask when kids are applying for this program. So if the organization had not, in fact, done this test in this way, then they would have realized that the form was a problem. They would have changed the form. They would have realized the hours were a problem, and they would have changed the hours. But they would not have realized that the Latino families were subject to this line of really racist questioning that is not, in fact, legal to engage in, and they would not have demanded that the caseworkers in the S-chip office were trained not to ask those kinds of questions. So if they hadn't taken a racial look, if they hadn't really understood the racial dimensions of this problem, then they would not have solved the problem for everybody. And let me tell you something, there is no worse note for unity, for the project of unity, than leaving a third of your people out of the solution that's supposed to be a universal solution. Now, we can be explicit in our discussion about race, but we don't have to be exclusive about it. I take my cues from Dr. King in this regard. On the 40th anniversary of his assassination, King's biographer, Taylor Branch, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And in that op-ed, he wrote that Martin Luther King thought that race was a part of everything, but not all of anything. And that is the way that I see the world. There has not been an issue yet that someone has put in front of me that I could not pick out the racial dimension of. And yet, it's not that there are other dimensions. There's an economic dimension, there's a gender dimension, there's a sexual dimension, there's an environmental dimension, there's a geographic dimension. So issues and people and systems and lives are complicated. And oversimplifying things by deciding that this is all about race and therefore we can't talk about gender or any other system of oppression, that just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It keeps us in these little silos and it prevents us from solving the problem for everybody. So we must be prepared to be explicit but never exclusive about our racial justice commitments. The second thing we have to do is recognize that racism implicates everybody. The racial discourse is about everybody. And listen, you're a 99% white audience, and so I'm going to speak to the white people in this audience. White people tend to think that race doesn't have anything to do with them. It doesn't apply to them. They don't have a racial identity themselves. They get to be universal. They don't have to think about their racial identity, about what it's going to bring to them in terms of privilege or punishment. And yet, it isn't just good for white people that racism exists. In fact, for struggling white people, the things that they need society to provide, to embrace, those things are so often disrupted by a racist stereotype that the freeloader, the brown person, is going to come in and get that thing, and therefore we can't have unemployment insurance, we can't have universal health coverage, we can't have welfare programs, we can't have great public education for everybody, because you know what? If we have those kinds of things, then some brown person is going to come and steal it from you. So during the debate on how to expand the state children's health insurance program in Congress, for example, Republicans who did not want to expand the program, they made up a new acronym for S-chip. They called it Socialist, Clinton-esque Healthcare for Illegals and Their Parents. There's nothing accurate about that acronym, and yet it was, and it is clearly racialized. It's clearly about keeping the brown, freeloading immigrant from being able to get what really only you deserve. And yet, it held up the expansion of this great program that benefits many, many, many struggling white families and white children over time. Now, white people and other people too think that you have to be perfect in your own mind before you can take on the racial dimensions of a political issue or of an institution. There are 4 levels at which racism operates. There's the individual, that's what you think in your own head. There's the interpersonal, that's what happens when you interact with other people, and is particularly dangerous if someone in that interaction has more power than someone else. And then there are the institutional and the structural levels where you start to get into the rules of society, into the policies as well as the practices that determine how people's lives actually go. So people tend to think that this is a chronology, these 4 levels. First, you have to fix your own brain and get all your biased ideas out of it. Then after that, you're able to make some friends. And then if your friends don't complain all the time about how offensive you are, then you can take on some political issues. Well, the people who have logged some years in here, you know that that job of dealing with your own biases, being open to other people, understanding how various systems affect people, that is a project that lasts your entire lifetime. And maybe it even might go on after you die. I'm not positive about that, but I think that's a real possibility. So if we decide that we need to wait until we have all our ideas together before we can make some friends and take some action, nothing is ever going to happen, I can guarantee it. Now, are you going to make some mistakes because you don't have your head all together? Absolutely you are. And I am giving you permission today, right now, you can tell people, Rinku Sen gave me permission to make racial mistakes. Go make some mistakes, learn from them, and then make some new mistakes, because that is the only way that we are going to build the intellectual and emotional and political and communal capacity to deal with our racial problems together. We have to be able to be frank, and in order to be frank, we have to be able to trust that when we make a mistake, someone is going to correct us with compassion, and that we're going to be able to get past that point and do the correct thing. That brings me to my last point, the thing that we need to be prepared to do, and that is to embrace emotional danger. Doing the work of fighting racism or fighting sexism or fighting homophobia, that work is difficult. It engages conflict. People will disagree with you and they will make you mad. They will hurt your feelings. They will, when you make a mistake and you get corrected, that feels kind of not great. There will be losses. Sometimes we actually lose a fight. We don't always win, like the Idaho Community Action Network was able to do. But it's very important when we are confronted with those emotions that we don't suppress them. Because when you suppress an emotion, it forms a block inside of your body, inside of your heart. And that block forms a tenderness around it. And every time somebody says something that touches that tenderness, you have an outsized reaction. And you tend to withdraw inside of yourself again. And you withdraw from the fight, from the discourse, from the struggle. So you don't want that to happen. You don't want that kind of block to form. And the best way to prevent it from forming is just to let the emotional things that are going to happen. Let them flow. Let it flow into your body and out of your body. Recently, a friend of mine sent me this fragment of a Rilke poem in which Rilke wrote, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." No feeling is final. No triumph is final. No grief is final. Everything passes. But it can pass in a way that leaves a block inside of you, or it can pass in a way that leaves you open and free. Now, I've been doing this work for a very long time now, more than 20 years. And people think of me, because it's racial justice work, people think of me as a professional person of color, kind of the way you might think of Pat Buchanan as a professional white man. But I was not always this person. As Walter mentioned, when I was 5 years old, my family immigrated from India. I spent my entire life, my entire childhood growing up in white factory towns because my father was a metallurgical engineer. And all I wanted to do as an immigrant kid was be an American. And I did that by watching hours and hours of television every day. I like to think of myself as proof that it's okay to park your kids in front of the TV and walk away. They're going to be fine. So I watched many, many hours of television every day. I was so attached to thinking of, to not recognizing my brown skin, not seeing that it had any effect on my life, that when I went to college and my college had a pre-orientation program for incoming students of color, I skipped it. I thought that didn't have anything to do with me. But luckily, I was able to make a couple of really good friends in my first year. And in our sophomore year, there was an incident on our campus where a black freshman was beaten up by 2 white football players, and that sparked this entire campaign for racial justice on our campus. There were rallies and meetings happening, and I was skipping them all. So one night, I was with my friends, Yuko and Valerie, and there was a rally the next day. They wanted me to go, and I said, no, that's not for me, that's not about me. And they said, they did an intervention on me because I was on the drug of denial. They said, listen, Rinku, you are not a girl anymore, you're a woman now, and you're not a person, you're not a minority, you're a person of color. And it's time to grow up and go to the rally. And so I went. Sometimes when your friends do an intervention, you actually listen, even if you are on drugs, like denial. And so I went to the rally, and it was kind of a straggly rally, 20, 25 people, handwritten signs, not such great chants. And yet, inexplicably, at that rally, for the first time in 12 years, I felt like I belonged. And that was the moment that I understood being an American is not about eating hot dogs and looking like Marsha Brady. Being an American is about investing in the community in which you find yourself and doing everything you can with the people around you to make that the most inclusive, the most compassionate, the most effective community it can be. And it seems to me that the way in which my friends loved me that night, the way in which they did that intervention, that's real love. That's not a pandering kind of love that says, oh, you want to go sit in your corner and not see reality? We'll bring you food and water. The way that my friends loved me, they said, come out of that corner is a prison. You cannot stay in that corner, you're not allowed to. We'll feed you and water you only if you come out of the corner. And that's the kind of love that we can use to transform ourselves, to transform our communities, to transform the world that we live in. And we have to do it. There's nothing less at stake than the health and safety of the planet and the human dignity of every single person on that planet. With that kind of love, we can tell a new story about race in America. And I know that I'm going to be telling that story, and I'm so grateful that you know how to tell that story too. I look very much forward to seeing you in that struggle and to seeing you in the light of many, many victories to come. Thank you so much.